Thank you. Hi. I really can't see anyone, so I'm going to have to adopt that tip about looking straight out ahead above people's heads and just try and pretend I know where your heads are. My nerdy confession is that I used to read dictionaries and then I started collecting them. Because you can tell a lot about language and how it evolves by collecting them over a number of years. So whoever that is, I'm with you. If you'd like a Funk and Wagnalls from about 1966 to have a look through, I've got one. I'm a futurist. I'm a professional futurist. I'm a qualified futurist. I'm also a qualified feminist, but that's a whole other discussion. So why am I... Yeah, that's a whole other discussion. But there are feminist futures. So why am I a qualified feminist? I did a bit of study. I did a qualification at Swinburne in strategic foresight, and I am known as a foresight practitioner or a futurist. The problem with foresight, though, is that it is long on buzzwords. So just quickly, this is what I'm not going to talk about tonight. Sorry. And this is why. I'd like to start with some facts around strategic foresight. So I fell into it because I was working in brand strategy, and I basically got fed up with working on things that lasted only 60 seconds or maybe 6 months in the market. And I figured that there had to be something else, that all of this briefing and work that I was doing originated somewhere. And it actually, it's another story, another discussion, but it was a beer that got me into strategic foresight. And not because I was drinking it, but because it was a brief based on an innovation process at Foster's. And the innovation process was derived from strategic foresight. And you know what? That beer is still in the market because we got it right. And that's the trouble with the future. It doesn't exist. And you can challenge me on that later if you wish, but it doesn't. It hasn't happened yet. It's not a particular place in time that we land or get to. It doesn't physically exist. It doesn't exist, except maybe in space and time in another dimension, and Alan can probably talk better about that than I can. But we haven't created it yet. And there's always more than one future, and I'll get to this. So tonight when I'm talking, I will be talking mostly about futures in plural. The other thing is that most of the ideas we have around futures are in the present. And that's partly to do with our neurology and the way our brains work. We tend to like to retrieve images and memories around futures from a little bit kind of around here. And it's grounded in what we know now. It's grounded in what we experience as opposed to imagining alternatives. But the best thing about all of that is that I'm not here to predict anything. So the usual jokes about I don't have a crystal ball, I can't do tax lotto numbers, I don't have anything on the cup, let alone that thing that's happening on Saturday, and I know nothing about football. I can't do that. It would be wrong of me. And my responsibility as a professional futurist or a foresight practitioner is not to predict. You can't predict something that doesn't exist. Does anyone remember Y2K? But did it happen? Well, it kind of did and it kind of didn't. And it didn't happen because we did something about it. So I'll just drop the words climate crisis and refer to a slide in a presentation earlier this evening from Alan. We didn't do anything much about that either. So Y2K is a lesson that we should remember. And the other thing is that it is my responsibility as a futurist to say I don't know. So if you ask me what's going to happen in 12 months or 5 years or 55 years, I can't tell you. All I can do is help you ask better questions about what might happen or where we might be in that particular place or time down the track. The point of all of this is that the future has to be created, and that's up to us. We got here by virtue or otherwise of the decisions that we've made. So climate crisis yet again. But there is always more than one way to create it, and that's particularly up to us to do. So those kind of imagined futures, those images of futures that we have, it's up to us to make them manifest, to bring form, to give them material form, and for us to inhabit them, because the future is a dimension of our imagination. And that's why the most ridiculous ideas about futures are the most wonderful. They're the most enriching and they're the most exciting when we think about what the world might be like or what worlds might be like down the track. Jim Dator, who's a futurist, got to run a course at the University of Hawaii, not a bad place to study futures. he has talked about the most ridiculous ideas about futures being the most useful. And they are, because they challenge us. They're the things that surprise us and confront us. And they're the things that make us go, oh, really? Will that happen? And the example that I'll use for this is me sitting at one end of a hallway in a house when I was about 23. And my then boyfriend sent me a message via Win pop-up. And I went, why the hell are you messaging me? I'm down the hallway. We text message each other sitting next to each other. I wasn't a futurist then. I didn't know that it was going to be that exciting to do this. But that was a technology that we hadn't imagined would be as successful as it was. So these early origins of things, that seemed ridiculous to me that we would communicate. My then boyfriend also ran a bulletin board. Anyone remember those? Yeah, not many of us. Not many, because we're a bit older to be able to remember a bulletin board. Well, someone imagined these technologies, or someone's made them happen. And that's the point about futures, that we're the ones who will make them happen, not the things around us. Yes, there is constraint, and yes, we have challenges to work through, but we are the ones that can make them possible. So just because it's Nerd Night, I've got a couple of more academic-y kind of slides. The first is to distinguish between futures thinking and strategic foresight. So if you think of futures thinking as the bigger, broader discipline, the academic discipline that embraces all of the theories and tools and methods around foresight, and it's been studied for at least 70 years, but you can actually trace futures work back to Jules Verne and people like that. Arguably, there were the soothsayers of ancient Greece and Rome and the diviners. So there was futuring work going on, even if it was considered best to divine the world based on birds' entrails. But we've been doing it, yeah, that's what they did. Cut them open, say, oh, what's in there? That's exciting. And it's not necessarily the best way to go about it for the birds or for us. But that's what we did, because we want to be able to understand what's going on around us. We kind of want certainty, or that's the mantra that business wants to give us anyway. And so futures thinking is that bigger, broader discipline. It embraces things like the discipline of anticipation, which is anticipatory systems, natural, manufactured, synthetic, technical, and so on. Whereas strategic foresight is the stuff that we do to make it happen. So strategic foresight is a set of tools and processes. I'm going to talk about a couple of them tonight. They're the things we do to help people imagine and then bring form to those potential futures. And strategic foresight is doing it in ways that we can actually grapple with. So there are particular things that we use to measure the way the tools work. And there are also the bigger, well, I suppose the more esoteric or cerebral capacities around strategic foresight in scenarios work. Has anyone been aware of the Shell scenarios? So Shell's one of the bigger companies that we might not want to talk about, but they pioneered scenario work. And the only reason that they are still relatively successful now is because of the scenarios work that they did in the 70s. They didn't depict, they predict. And if you follow me on Twitter, you will constantly see me using the hashtag depictions, not predictions. Because we can't predict and we shouldn't predict. What we can do is craft narratives of visions and images of those futures that we might want to create or inhabit. So the best way to think about futures is to actually go back in time. I know that some of you weren't even born then. Yep. This is the crisis that we have with futures. Not all of us remember way back when. But I'll just give you a snapshot of what was going on then. So some of us were listening to Kylie and Jason. Some of us were listening to Nirvana's Bleach. So it was before they got famous. It was also a pretty landmark year in terms of certain things around the world. I'm not expecting you to recognise all of those images. Some of you may not know who that gentleman is standing with the other gentleman who happens to be Bob Hawke. That's the other Bush. That's the first Bush who made it to president. Tim Berners-Lee, this is the year that celebrates HTML. Yep, I know. That whole Telnet thing, yeah, I remember the SCSI thing and the dial-up to Monash Caulfield to be able to log into the library 24 hours straight. Noticeably on this slide, yes, Madonna is up there as well, and she's still here with us. It was an interesting year. We were making our way from the first World AIDS Day onto the second World AIDS Day. And it's, again, a marker of how far we've come, but also how far we haven't come. It was the year in which the climate crisis was really talked about. So a NASA scientist first mentioned it in US in late '88, I believe. We also, and I'm referring to the images of cigarettes that we saw in a presentation earlier, not only were we using cigarettes for promotion, but we were using them, well, the US was using them, to promote Dukakis and Bush competing for the presidency. So there was a lot going on there. Photoshop was being shipped and actually shipped, being put in boxes, sent across the world on that little thing there. That little floppy disk. Some of you may not have actually seen one for real, but you still use it when you hit save on your computer because the semiotics of that image transcend all of the other meanings that it's grown from. So that's 30 years back. What might the world be like 30 years from now? It's hard to tell, particularly when we're thinking about all of the challenges that we have. 30 years ago, we had a population of 5 million. The figures suggest we're heading towards a world of 9 million in about 30, 40 years. But in the last couple of years, that has always been debated again. So that's why we can't predict the future, because 5 years ago, we were headed for 9 million. But 3-4 years ago, sorry, billion, thank you, Scott. Yeah, I shrunk it. See, that's what I can do. But the challenge has been around population decline. So whereas we were talking about billions, 9 billion, some figures are now saying it might actually go back towards 6 or 7 billion because of the shifts in our attitudes, our culture, and also our willingness to change the world that we're in. So the bigger question, again, from there is, what are you going to do about it? So have a think about where you might be 30 years from now. So I'm going to be 80. So 80 is going to be a different world for me. I will have probably only been retired for 5 or so years. Yeah. Yeah. See, futures take on a different dimension the further you go out in time. If you're in your 20s, you're going to be older than your parents. You're going to be looking back on stuff and thinking, oh, I should have done that. Or I shouldn't have done that. So it's important that we think about time, not just backwards and what we've done and what we've achieved, but also what we want to do with that time. Because it's this kind of intolerable uncertainty that we live with every day, despite what business tells us. We don't need certainty. We actually live in a complex adaptive system. Uncertainty is what prevails in everything that we do. We can't guarantee anything. If I ask you what you're doing tomorrow, you'll probably have a fair idea. Who knows what they're doing? And I can't see everyone's hands, but who knows what they're doing a week from now? Come on, certainty? A year from now. Yeah. Yeah. Who knows what they're doing a year from now? Yeah. Longer out in time you go, the fewer hands will go up. Because we don't have that certainty. And even catching public transport here tomorrow would give us a degree of uncertainty. We've got a fair idea that we're going to catch a whatever and a whatever with a backup plan B, C, D. But we know we'll get to work. We're just not entirely sure that it will happen in the way that we think it should or the way that we might expect it to. And this is the point of the work that I do as a futurist. So it's talking about alternative futures. And here's the nerdy slide. So I've got one PhD supervisor sitting here, and the other one created this. This is the futures cone. Joseph Forrest conceived this in 2003, and it talks about futures starting over here from wherever you are standing or looking from a point in time, and then moving out in time into the unknown. And the further out in time you go, the more possibilities there are. And generally in foresight terms, we talk about possible, preferred and plausible futures. There's actually another 4. But the things that we really want to be focusing on are the possible, all of those amazing futures that we could have. The plausible are the things that are probably likely maybe to happen, or the things that seem most likely to happen based on our current state. And then there's the preferred futures, which are the ones that we really want. And mostly they are utopian or protopian futures, hopefully. I'm a dark dystopian futurist because, is this when I'm allowed to swear? Generally, we're a bit fucked. So I have to be honest about it. But the further out in time you go, the more possibilities there are. So like that public transport option. If you think about what you're going to be doing next week, you've got a few more options to choose from. And further out in time, the more things that are possibly on your radar, the more things that you might want to explore. It's up to you to decide which futures you really want. Which are your preferred futures? Which are the ones that are going to happen around you? And which are the ones that you're going to let happen around you? The challenge with all of this is that we tend to get paralysed by all of that immense uncertainty and all of that we don't know really what we're doing. So I've got a couple of slides to just give you some tips because that's what I do. Avoid business as usual. So if you haven't read a book called The Limits to Growth, please do. If you haven't read a book called Not the Future We Ordered, please do. They will talk about and help you understand this notion of the alternatives and the challenges that come around, particularly around growth. We also want to have a view and hold it lightly. So the person we are now is not necessarily the person we'll be tomorrow. It will not necessarily be the person we'll be in 5 years. So learn to move with things. The ephemeral affects us, and let it go. Be willing to change and be open. So from Theory U, open mind, open heart, open will. Also, don't assume. But look back at what was happening 10 years ago. There was stuff that didn't happen even though it was predicted. I come from a design background, so I'm still waiting for the death of print. We've been talking about the death of print for about 15 years. It hasn't died yet. But that serves those in the digital world who want to see the death of print because it propagates work and, I suppose, opportunities within the digital space. And don't get caught up with trends. Trends are current. It's what's happening now. So if all you're doing is responding to trend, you're just going to continue propagating what we've already got. You need to either be ahead of trend in marketing terms, or you need to anticipate what the possibilities are beyond that trend. And yep, that's why I get paid to do a job, because that's what I help people do. There's always a Gibson quote at one of these things. So mine tonight is not the one you expect, which, by the way, he doesn't remember saying. But he doesn't remember saying it, but The Economist claims it. So I would leave you with this one instead, and just be mindful of what that future is going to be when it's looking back on you. Thank you.
Thank you, Bridgette. What a fascinating talk. We'll take a few questions. Yep. Science fiction and its role.
If we didn't have science fiction, we wouldn't have a lot of the images of futures. Science fiction challenges us, but also enriches what we do. The Motorola clamshell phone is an obvious example. The things that the space elevator that Arthur C. Clarke has talked about, all of those things get presented as options, and if we don't have those images, then we've got nothing to aspire to. And this is where design becomes not only complicit, but also positively opportunistic around futures, because we need people who can take what's in here and give it form that we can work with. So yeah, science fiction, love it. Particularly the stuff that talks about alternative sentient life forms, other life forms apart from humanity, other worlds and other possibilities. Anything that allows us to think beyond ourselves has got to be good.
Another question? Yep, Wade. Elon Musk.
Oh, yeah. I love the ambition, but it's all about him. It's not actually necessarily about that a protopian world or a utopian world. Also, there are challenges around some of the technology. So, and this is a guesstimate, but 5 years ago, before lithium was new and sexy for batteries and an alternative power source, we had maybe 300 years worth. In the last couple of years, that's declined, and we maybe have 50, 100 years worth. So those kinds of new technologies are great because it shows us possibilities. But we need to look back on what those possibilities and the unintended consequences. So that's where things like a futures wheel help, because you're able to identify not just the action here, but the first, second, and third order consequences from the decisions that you make. So yeah, I admire the guy's tenacity, but I don't necessarily think he's got the answers.
Nice guy, but try harder. Question from the back. Yep.
You talked earlier about the information media trails and such, which may have been genuine attempts to see the future, or may have been simply about control.
Yes.
Control of the future.
Yep.
Public policy and interactions with the public space. How do we try to wrest back control from those who might want to own that future that really belongs to all of us?
How do we wrestle back the future that belongs to everybody?
So this is where we need to understand which we we're talking about. So if we look at this space here, we're all united by something tonight, but that doesn't mean that we are united over a period of time over lots of different things. So when we talk about we and our futures, we need to be mindful of whose futures we're working towards, who we're crafting futures for, and what stake we have in that. In futures work, we often ask who is privileged, who benefits, and who is disadvantaged. Once you start answering those questions, then you can move towards, well, who is this serving and what do we do about it? The other thing is to break the system from the inside. So work from within the system, because we are in that complex adaptive system. Do what we can, find the levers, break the stuff we need to, and look at alternative ways of approaching not just futures, but our day-to-day living. So practices around commons and commonsing, big in Europe, the transition towns network that's in the UK, those kinds of alternative ways of living, consuming, and so on are really good ways of pushing, not just from the inside, but putting pressure on the systems that reside, like the big institutions and policymakers. Also, we as people can build our capacity for longer-term thinking. That's the biggest challenge for us, to think beyond the next pay packet or the next sales cycle. So whether it's us as an individual thinking what I've got going on here immediately, or whether I'm in a decision-making role and I can say, actually, I'll ignore the next quarter, I'm going to think around 2 or 3 years out. Because believe it or not, some of the bigger organisations are doing that. They may not seem to be doing it from what we are exposed to as consumers, but a lot of them are. Cigarette packaging is an example of, so the plain packaging legislation is an example of a foresight process. They knew the legislation was imminent, so cigarette companies said, we're going to do something about it. Now at that point, had we realised as people what that meant, maybe we could have acted harder on the initial legislation around plain packaging. But it's a mix of collective and individual responsibility. And I wish I had a better answer for you, but the most I can do is say, just challenge. And there's a paper called The Moral Impediment to Foresight Action by Peter Hayward. That's a good read too.
Lots to add on your reading list. We'll take one more question. Yep.
Yep. So if you look at a trend, you can extrapolate over time, but you're only ever using historical or current data. What you want to do is look for weak signals. So go out a few years. Things mostly go in cycles, whether it be political cycles, cycles around individual agency, culture, and so on. If you look for those, you can see where changes are likely to happen, and you start to imagine wildcards. So if you looked at the cycle in the US, I used President Trump being elected as a wildcard in scenarios work, and everyone said that will never happen. So when you're I know. I actually used it in a class with students, and 3 of them have said to me since, I remember that class, and we all said, no, that was ridiculous. See, most ridiculous ideas about the future are the most useful. If you look for those ridiculous things, you can then cast that in to a potential pathway or trajectory, say, what if this would happen? How would that change? There's no hard and fast rule, but the main thing with trends is to remember that you are working with now and backwards, and if you just continue to work that through without allowing for any kind of shift or transition or anything radical happening, then you will assume, and that's how we got the GFC. That's why we've had discussion around the real estate bubble for the last 5 years in Australia. Yeah. No one's willing to go, oh, maybe that's not right. Yeah. Oh, the global financial crisis? Yeah.
Let's put
Yeah,
our
that
hands...
was predicted by 3 people and we ignored it.
Well, we
Yeah.
hear it now. Let's put our hands together. Thank you so much for taking the time to spend with us, Bridgette.
Thank you.